Hi all, today we're talking about Wood's Chapter 4 about verbal communication. So let's get started. But first, think about a previous chapter and content. What is the definition of culture? If this doesn't show up in your brain or your notes, you should definitely go back and look at it, because this answers things like if you're working with someone from a different culture, so let's say from primarily collective culture, think about what strategies or phrases might you use to persuade them. So for instance, this would be in comparison to a very individualistic culture, which the US is. As we think about Chapter 4 and verbal communication, Wood's focus questions are: how are language and thought related? What abilities are possible because humans use symbols? What are practical implications of recognizing that language is a process? And how do rules guide verbal communication? So let's start off by figuring out what verbal communication is. Largely it's language. And so this is the idea that it consists of symbols in the form of spoken or written words. Right? So not only oral, but also written. And so when we talk about verbal, we're not only talking about oral. So a question for you to think about is, does ASL count? ASL is American Sign Language. So it's not written. Do we count it as spoken? Right, so let me know what you think about that. Words themselves are created from combinations of symbols. Letters are symbols, numbers are symbols. And a symbol is arbitrary. The only reason that a symbol has meaning is because someone has given it that meaning. Someone has defined this is what this collection of lines means for us. And then when we put together these little collections of lines into bigger collections of lines, here's what that means. And so words are symbols, but they're collections and combinations of smaller symbols, of letters, or of sounds. So when we think about language, it's got three primary pieces we need to remember. Language is arbitrary, it is ambiguous, and it is abstract. And remember way back in Chapter 1 when we talked about the definition of communication and that communication is symbolic, we talked about symbols are arbitrary, are ambiguous, and abstract. And so this makes sense to see it again because language is composed of symbols. So arbitrary, again, means there's no organic, natural meaning. Somebody picked what it means, right? Someone at some point, even if it was 1,000 years ago, said, here's the word I'm going to select in order to talk about, to represent this item, this chair, this desk, this book, this person, this position, right? Whatever it might be. So because of this, language is ambiguous. It can have multiple meanings, and we see that happen a lot with miscommunications. I mean one thing, you mean another, even though we're using the same word. And language is also very abstract, and what that means is that it lets us think about higher order concepts. We can think about God, religion, pride, love. These are very, very abstract concepts that don't have a tangible, material element to them. So the only thing that allows us to do this, to share those ideas, is with language of some form. And so when we think about communication competency, our goal in order to minimize miscommunication is to be very specific in the language you use and to know how it might be arbitrary, how it might be ambiguous, and how it might be abstract, right? So how might others interpret it based on these elements of language? So some basics of verbal communication. A lot of you have heard the terms denotative meaning and connotative meaning. Denotative, think dictionary, right? So if you look up the meaning in the dictionary, here's what it means. Connotative meaning is within context, within your experiences, here's how you think of this concept. So if I say puppy, right, I will likely think of my own dog, who's a Beagle Hound mix and was a rescue, so it's kind of a pain sometimes. Or perhaps I'll think about my partner's puppy, who's a very different personality than my own dog. But I'm guessing you think of a dog that you grew up with, or your neighbor's dog, or perhaps you think about how horrible dogs are because you're allergic or had this terrible experience with them. And so even though the denotative meaning of puppy or dog is going to be canine, usually 4 legs, tail, fur, teeth, right? This very generic dictionary definition. The connotative meaning is very attached to your experiences with that. And so our connotative meanings, they vary by person, by culture, by region. These are going to vary a lot. So for instance, if I say woman in blue suit, denotative meaning, someone of female body or who identifies as woman wearing a suit that is the color blue. But we have some very different examples, right? So we have the stock image on the left of a woman in a blue suit. We have Hillary Clinton in the middle in a blue suit. And on the right, we have Krista McCullough, who was an astronaut who was killed in the Challenger explosion, also a teacher. And so these are very, very different women in very different types of blue suits. And they also, you notice that they're pretty racially narrow. So there's a lot of other versions of woman in blue suits that are going to come to mind for other people. It's important to note what it means that language is abstract. And so when we talk about the abstracting process, this is one to spend some time with. It's a process whereby we formulate increasingly vague conceptions of our world by leaving out more and more details. So the more abstract something is, the more general it is, and the fewer details it includes. So see an example, right? So we start with the sense experience, and from a sense experience we try to describe what it is that we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing. And that description is the words, is the language. Inference is meaning we attach to it. And then judgment is what do we think about this thing now that we've described it. So let's go back to this idea of a woman in a blue suit. We have this sense experience. It's very, very difficult to put into words. A sense experience has way too many elements for us to actually be able to break down. So this is very general. Right, so we roughly get the sense that different people wear different things. We describe what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, so this is reporting it. The woman's wearing a blue suit. We then make a guess as to what that means, right? So the woman's wearing the suit in order to look professional, and we pass this judgment that says the woman wearing the navy blue suit is a good employee, right? Because she's trying to be professional. So that's a very, very abstract concept from the very specific, this is what this person looks like. So sense experience, there are others around me, they seem to be like me. You try and report that. I'm part of a large group of people. That group has been labeled as a nation. You can try and guess what that means for you. If I act supportively of this group, which is called nation, others in it will perceive me well, and that's a positive thing. And judgment and evaluation, so this is positive. Oh, patriotism, right? Patriotism is that pride and love of country. That's a very abstract concept compared to people's everyday tangible experience. There's more discussion of the abstracting process within the additional materials. Basically, if you think about the number of steps that it takes to get from Betsy, this cow, right, this very particular cow on my farm, and then as opposed to just Betsy the cow, it becomes a cow, right? And it becomes livestock, and livestock is a very abstract concept compared to the individual Betsy cow, which I know is a cheesy example, but really is one that you can find floating around. So language allows us to do some very important things. It allows us to define phenomena, to evaluate the phenomena, to organize our experiences, to define our relationships and interactions. It allows for us to have hypothetical thought, and it allows for self-reflection. So defining phenomena, we can label things. Evaluating them, we can pass judgment on them. Are these good things? Are these bad things? We can organize our experiences. Oh, classroom. Okay, I know what classroom is. This is where this fits, right, within my scheme of things. Right? We define relationships and interactions. Think of defining your relationship on Facebook. Is it public? Is it not? It's a really big deal as you change that relationship, and it's just one word that's changing, but it becomes a big deal. Hypothetical thought, this is the idea that language allows us to talk about things that are not in the immediate here and now. We can make plans for the future, we can talk about memories of the past, we can have ideas of, well, if this happens, then maybe I can go to Mars, right? Whatever it might be. And language allows us for self-reflection. It allows us to think about and to talk about who am I, right? How do I define myself? How do I understand myself? And it also allows us to reflect on language itself, right? And we call this going meta, as you've learned from your meta communication assignment. So language allows us to talk about language, talk about communication. Are we doing it well? To offer advice? All these pieces. So these are the 6 items that you should know. Language allows us to do these things. And language matters in a lot of areas of our life, obviously. And so 2 keywords I want to give you is jargon and slang. So jargon, I have some examples here for you. Aunt Minnie, 86th, in the weeds, boofing, grubbing, take, Uncle Bob. And slang, some examples, bay, ratchet, turnt, selfie, on fleek, throw shade. And fair enough, especially the slang changes often enough. Some of these might start to be outdated soon, but these are some ones that I've talked about recently with students. So when we look at these words, a lot of them don't make sense, right? Unless you're on the inside group who knows. So jargon is technical language that's specific to a field. And it might be funny to think that Aunt Minnie is technical language, or in the weeds is technical language, or boofing is technical language. But Aunt Minnie, for radiologists, is this idea that I see something going on in the scan, I've seen it before, I recognize it and I know it. And the story goes that radiologist way back when was trying to explain to someone else and said, you know, it's like my Aunt Minnie shows up at the front door. I don't have to go through every step in the book to figure out who it is. I've seen her before. I know who she is. I recognize her. Right? 86th and in the weeds come from the service industry, and I'm sure other places. 86th means you're out of something or someone's kicked out. I have no idea the background of that. In the weeds means I'm so busy right now. I'm drowning. Right? So we use a lot of metaphors in these examples of jargon. And if you're a kayaker, boofing is when you are coming off a fall, a waterfall, or kind of taking a drop into water, basically. If someone's a kayaker, you can give me a more specific definition to use next time. So jargon is also going to be all that medical language that we hear, all the lawyer language that we hear on shows. So technical language very specific to this hobby or this field or this job. Right? And so people who are part of that hobby or field or job are going to know that technical language. And one of the hardest parts of joining a new area is that you don't know the language yet. And so you don't yet know how to interact. And you have to learn that as you're learning all the skills. Slang, on the other hand, is an informal language of a group. It's very generational. It's often very regional. For instance, when I worked in Virginia, I kept hearing about Beach Week and Beach Week and Beach Week. And so I finally asked what it meant. And it's what students refer to when they're a senior in high school and they go spend a week at the beach partying, right? And that's just what it's called. There's no definition of it. This is just kind of what the folks in that region have taken on as a habit, have taken on as a tradition, and so have a name for it. Right? So slang changes very quickly over time. On fleek, for example, I think was made famous by a celebrity. So there's a lot of different ways that we see things developing. Selfie is becoming more of a formal term because so many people have picked it up. It actually shows up in the dictionary now and was the word of the year a few years ago. Ratchet, I'm assuming, comes from the word wretched, W-R-E-T-C-H-E-D, which is a word for not feeling well or for being terrible. But ratchet, as we talk about the slang word, has definitely taken on some slightly different meanings. So it's important to think about how does the slang that you know, the jargon that you know, relate to your identity and the groups that you're a part of. Language also matters because identity and power are enacted through language, and this is a very important part of language. So we might enact identity through the titles that we have: CEO, boss, freshman versus senior, instructor versus professor, graduate student versus faculty. Labels that we apply. Labels are often gender-based or ableist or race-based, right? So if we talk about a doctor versus a woman doctor, right, or a nurse versus a male nurse, those are very gender-based labels that tell us through that language the social expectation of who does what roles, right? And so we're trying to change those things, but we depict a lot of our ideologies, a lot of our social understandings through the language that we use. Quite a few of the resources that I've offered you in additional resources are about this language and power piece. So for instance, ableist language, race-based language, language and social justice, because it makes such a profound impact on people's lives based on what we call them. And even the ability to speak your own language is very much a marker of power, right? There are so many Native communities that were literally banned from speaking their own language. And if children were put into boarding schools, they were beaten if they spoke their own language. And so we've lost so many languages because it was a power play by colonizing forces to get Native cultures to assimilate, right? Or to culturally kill them off in general. So that even the ability to speak your own language and current attempts to reclaim languages are very linked to identity and power. In a very personal identity piece, I think it's worth you taking a minute and thinking about, would you ever change your last name? A lot of folks are very connected to their last name. A lot of others we use nicknames for our first names, so that last name is usually more steady throughout our lives. So would you change it? Would you change it if you were married or for celebrity reasons, or to protect your identity, or for some other reason, right? And so think about the meanings attached to names. For some folks, their names have been handed down and handed down. Others, their names are created. So there's a case of a family who they were in California, and both the mother and the father wanted to keep their names for their own identity, but then they had kids, and so they combined their names into the last name Saber. So they combined their two last names. And that was in California. And then they moved somewhere in the South, and they had a third child, and the state said, that's not a real name, you can't. That's not one of your names, you can't use it. And so there's actually this very legal power play about who is able to assign names and select names, and are you allowed to make new names up, or are you very, very tied to your genealogy? So names have a lot of meaning, and I encourage you to think about what are the meanings behind your name, and would you ever change it, and why, and what implications does that have for identity? As we talked about culture and preserving your language, language really shapes our reality. So I have a quote here that says, "A different language is a different vision of life." And this is the idea that the words within our culture reflect and reiterate our cultural values. So we have the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and there's a couple versions of this, but the version of this that we'll talk about is called linguistic relativism. Initially, this theory said, if this culture doesn't have a word for time, they don't understand time. That doesn't exist in their world. And then others came along and said, no, that's a really ethnocentric way to look at that. Instead, let's acknowledge that depending on this culture's use of the words for, say, time or for money, don't mean that they don't have those concepts. It means that they think about those concepts differently than others do. So the idea of linguistic relativism within the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis states that our language and its rules strongly influence our thinking and our worldview. So for instance, if you take a look at these words, what do they suggest about the cultures that use them? Right? What does it suggest in the language of Urdu that there's one single word that means the transporting suspension of disbelief that can occur in good storytelling? Right? This idea of when you watch a film or read a book or hear a story, that you dive into that story, right? And you're part of that story. Right? So we can make the assumption that's a very storytelling-based culture, right? And there's a lot of cultures that are very oral, and they pass down their histories and they pass down their lessons through oral stories. Right? The Bible took a very long time to be written. That started as oral stories that were passed down until they started to try and compile them in written form. So if we think about sobremesa in Spanish, right? The time spent after lunch or dinner talking to the people who shared the meal with. This is something a lot of folks like to do. But when you look at having one word to describe this, what that tells you about the culture, often the Spanish-speaking cultures, is we have the importance of mealtime, the importance of taking time for that meal, the importance of relations with others, and how meals are very social, right? Does this mean every Spanish-speaking culture does this? No, right? But we can start to get better understandings of different cultures based on the languages that they speak and the elements within those languages. And so if you know any other languages, or even within English, think about, are there any words that really identify these are some of the values within this culture? Right? So for instance, in English, how many metaphors do we have for time? Killing time, being on time, time is money, right? So lots of different pieces for that. And language very much affects our perception of others. So, for instance, when we go to internet dating, then on the OkCupid blog, this is an entertaining blog, they take all of their big data from the millions of people who use the site and they run stats. So I've actually given you the website here if you'd like to look more into it, because it's fascinating when it comes to interactions and communication and culture. And the one example I've pulled out here for you is the opening words or messages that people send to one another in that first message and the chances of them getting a reply. So we see on the bottom of the graph it says the average reply rate is 32%, and so you can see the baseline, right, of the graph is here at 32%. And so if any of these, what we call NetSpeak words, appear in the messages, we can see by what percent the chances of receiving a message drop. So those words and that spelling that you use in that initial message has a very profound impact on how people perceive you. So bringing together some of the ideas of the past chapters, take a look. How does language use affect our perceptions of immigration and the people who immigrate to the U.S.? And I have some examples here. So we talk about immigrant rights or civil rights, right? There's so much meaning attached to this concept of civil rights. Right? And so by linking that to immigrant rights, what kind of meaning gets attached to immigrant rights? Right? Here we get this idea that illegal is not legal. The 14th Amendment was for blacks, not illegals. Stop illegal alien invasion. What this language does is it's very dehumanizing. We lose the person. Instead, we get alien. They're from outside. They're not understandable. They are unillegal. They're not a person, right? Instead, more humanizing language that we now try and use are undocumented workers or undocumented immigrants. And we don't call people aliens. We don't say you are illegal, right? Actions are illegal, not people. The invasion piece in this example on the bottom right is fascinating because that's such a scary word for us, to be invaded. But then up in the right, we have a pro-immigrant organization. It's called the Dreamers, and this is an act that they've been trying to pass for several years now. And this is the idea that children who were brought to the U.S. by their parents under the age of 19 would be eligible for citizenship if they went to college or served in the military. And so if they are willing to be a productive member of society, if they were brought to the U.S. as a child and so had no say in that, then they have the possibility of becoming a citizen. And so they are called Dreamers, and it's called a Dream Act. And so think about the meaning of that and that choice of wording compared to what we call the American dream. So think about other examples you've seen, and potentially other examples you see going on here, but it's important to consider how our language affects our perception of others and people's perception of us, especially when it comes to different cultural relationships and different identities.